We don't know sometimes what the blood type of the patient is. In that case, we start out with O-negative blood.
In a twist no one saw coming, scientists have finally solved the type O blood mystery in 2025, and what they discovered is sending shockwaves through the medical world.
So O-negative is amazing because even though it's only found in about 7% of Americans, it's the universal donor type.
It's not just about blood donations or universal donors anymore. Something hidden in indigenous DNA may hold the key to a forgotten chapter in human evolution. Even Tucker Carlson called the findings unsettling.
The problem is that O-negative is only 7% of the population, so we have a chance of running out.
What makes this blood type so unique? Why do certain populations still carry a version the rest of us lost? And most importantly, what does this mean for the future of human immunity? The answers might change everything. The blood type that changed everything. In the world of modern medicine, blood is categorized, labeled, and tested with clinical precision. But behind that sterile system lies one of biology's strangest puzzles: type O blood. On paper, it's the most common blood type in the world. In practice, it's anything but ordinary. Type O blood lacks both A and B antigens on the surface of red blood cells. That absence makes it special. In emergencies, especially when doctors don't have time to test a patient's blood type, type O negative is the universal go-to. It can be given to nearly anyone. No A, no B, no surprises. It's the ultimate donor blood. And yet that very simplicity is what makes it so mysterious. Why would evolution favor a blood type that gives so freely, yet receives so narrowly? People with type O can only receive blood from other type O donors. That makes them vulnerable. In a disaster scenario, the universal donor might be the first to die without access to their own kind. But the medical quirks don't stop there. People with type O blood seem to have a built-in shield against certain diseases. Severe malaria, for example, is less likely to affect them fatally. Some studies suggest they have a lower risk of heart disease and fewer blood clots. On the other hand, they're more prone to stomach ulcers, complications from cholera, and they bleed more easily. It's a strange evolutionary trade-off, one that seems custom-built for specific environments, and yet unfit for others. This brings us to a more disturbing observation. Type O blood is not evenly distributed around the world. In some parts of Europe and Asia, it's common, but not dominant. In contrast, many indigenous populations in the Americas have almost nothing but type O. In some isolated Amazonian tribes, the percentage nears 100%. AB and AB are nowhere to be found. Why? For years, scientists pointed to isolation. After crossing the Bering Land Bridge thousands of years ago, these populations were cut off from the rest of humanity. Genetic drift and bottlenecks can do strange things when there's no new DNA mixing in. Still, that doesn't fully explain the uniformity. Even in isolated regions, you'd expect some variation. The total disappearance of other blood types in some groups feels deliberate, or at least driven by something we haven't identified yet. Some researchers have long suspected there's more to this than migration and chance. They've quietly studied type O's global patterns for decades, looking for answers in immune system genes, disease pressure, and even archaeological samples from ancient burials. And what they've found so far only adds more questions. Why did type O persist in its original form when A and B were evolving elsewhere? What was it about the Americas, and particularly its indigenous populations, that allowed this bloodline to remain unchanged? And could the key to understanding type O be hidden not in the cells themselves, but in the ancient environments that shaped them? In recent years, geneticists have started to unravel pieces of the puzzle. But it wasn't until 2025 that a team of researchers released findings that would shift everything we thought we knew. A single study, years in the making, began circulating among experts early this year. Its conclusions? Unexpected. Its implications? Possibly massive. And while the headlines were fast to frame it as a breakthrough, the scientists themselves offered a very different warning. As one of them put it, solving the type O mystery might be the easy part. Understanding what it means for humanity, that's where things get complicated. Why indigenous populations hold the key. If the mystery of type O blood had a map, the sharpest clues would point straight to the Americas. While most of the world shows a mix of blood types, A, B, AB, and O. Some indigenous populations in Central and South America have almost nothing but type O. Entire communities, especially among tribes in the Amazon, Andes, and Mesoamerica, test nearly 100% type O. It's not just rare, it's practically exclusive. This oddity didn't go unnoticed. In fact, it's been quietly studied since the mid-20th century. Early researchers chalked it up to isolation.
Scientists are one step closer to developing a universal blood type.
Our health reporter Pauline Chen tells us about research being done at the University of British Columbia.
According to the dominant theory, the ancestors of these groups migrated from Asia over the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. Once in the Americas, they spread out and became genetically cut off from the rest of the world. Over time, genetic drift, random changes in gene frequency, and population bottlenecks could have wiped out A and B alleles by chance. It sounds reasonable, and in many cases, isolation does explain unique genetic patterns, but this one stands out for its intensity. In no other part of the world do we see such a complete dominance of a single blood type. Even other isolated regions like island nations or remote mountain villages still carry a mix of blood groups. The fact that some indigenous populations carry only type O makes scientists question whether something more than randomness is at work. One possibility is selection pressure, something in the environment that actively favored type O blood. If a deadly disease swept through a community, and people with A or B blood were more likely to die from it, the survivors would naturally be those with type O. Over generations, this could drive the frequency of type O up, eventually to the point of exclusivity. But here's the problem. We still don't know what that disease would have been. There's no clear smoking gun in the archaeological or historical record. Another possibility is founder effect, the idea that a small group of early migrants just happened to carry mostly type O, and their descendants inherited it by default. But again, genetic data shows that A and B alleles are very old. It's strange that they would have vanished completely unless something pushed them out. Then there's the uncomfortable reality of colonial history. After European contact, indigenous populations were devastated by diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Some researchers wonder if type O may have offered even partial resistance to one of these plagues, increasing survival rates for those who carried it. It's a grim theory, but it fits with the idea that type O wasn't just preserved, it was selected. Whatever the cause, the results are clear. If you want to study type O in its most concentrated and unchanged form, you study indigenous peoples of the Americas. That's exactly what a group of international scientists did over the past decade. They partnered with tribes across the continent, collected blood samples, mapped genetic markers, and compared them to both modern and ancient DNA. The findings began piling up in databases and unpublished preprints. There was something different, not just in the blood types themselves, but in the way certain immune system genes were configured in these populations. Still, no one could say for sure what it meant. Was it a fluke of history, a disease-driven adaptation, or a window into something deeper? One of the lead researchers reportedly said, "If the story of blood is the story of human survival, then Indigenous DNA may be the last chapter we never read."
But Dr. Dana Devine from Canadian Blood Services says it's still early on in the development of this technique.
At the time, that sounded poetic, but by early 2025 it began to feel prophetic, because what they uncovered next wouldn't just raise eyebrows in genetics labs. It would challenge what we thought we knew about blood, ancestry, and the evolution of immunity itself. What the genetics really say. For decades, textbooks treated blood types as a solved riddle. We knew the ABO gene sits on chromosome 9, we knew point mutations swap one sugar-adding enzyme for another, and we knew type O results when that enzyme is missing a key base pair. Case closed, right? Not quite. Once genome sequencing became cheap after 2010, scientists started pulling thousands of indigenous DNA samples into global databases, and patterns popped that no one had predicted. First, the timeline. Molecular clocks that compare mutation rates show the oldest intact ABO sequences in ancient humans carry the type O variant. The two most common O alleles, called O01 and O02, diverged roughly 1.3 million years ago, long before Homo sapiens appeared. That alone makes type O the ancestral blueprint. The A and B enzymes arose later by adding or switching single nucleotides. So every person alive today still carries the genetic ghost of that original O template, even if the sugar coating part mutated into A or B centuries later. Second, the distribution. When researchers examined pre-Columbian remains from sites in Peru and the American Southwest, they saw the same O alleles that modern tribes still carry. That continuity rules out recent European admixture as the driver. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, skeletal samples from Bronze Age Siberia and Neolithic Europe already show mixed A and B lineages, meaning that by the time the first Americans crossed Beringia, populations in the Old World were already diversified. In other words, the Americas did not lose A and B later. They simply never imported them in large numbers to begin with. Third, the immune angle. The ABO gene is only part of a cluster that also regulates cytokine responses and pathogen recognition. In several Hyo-Amazonian groups, scientists found a unique haplotype that links type O with elevated expression of the gene FUT2. FUT2 is famous for secreting blood group antigens into bodily fluids, a feature that blocks certain strains of rotavirus and norovirus. That small molecular shield may have given O carriers a survival edge in tropical settings flush with waterborne disease. Lab assays confirm increased resistance in cell cultures, and epidemiological surveys match the benchmark. Villages with near-exclusive type O report fewer severe outbreaks of those stomach viruses, even when sanitation is poor. Fourth, the malaria paradox. In Africa and Southeast Asia, where malaria shaped human genomes for millennia, type O is common but never exclusive. The parasite's sticky proteins bind less efficiently to O-type red cells, reducing lethal clumping in capillaries.
We don't know. There is some data that supports the idea that if you're type O blood, maybe that is in some way preventing you from getting the disease.
Yet A and B linger because they protect against other local hazards, from cholera to certain strep toxins. This balancing selection explains the mosaic of blood types there. The Americas lacked an equally strong counterforce. With no Old World cholera, no endemic Plasmodium falciparum until post-contact, and limited dense settlement, nothing pressured A or B alleles to stick around. Genetic drift could then finish the job. Finally, the bottleneck math. Population geneticists ran computer simulations using migration figures derived from dental remains and Y chromosome diversity. Starting with a founding group of roughly 250 individuals carrying 70% type O, they could reach near fixation in less than 2,000 years if A and B imposed even a small fitness cost in a new environment. Add a late Pleistocene pandemic, perhaps a virus similar to parvovirus B19 that targets A and B antigens, and the model hits the observed numbers. Crucially, the simulations do not require any exotic gene source or secret intervention, just normal evolutionary rules plus harsh conditions. Put together, these data paint a clean, if still incomplete, picture. Type O is ancient. It rode the first migration wave into the Americas, and a mix of founder effect, modest selection pressures, and sheer luck let it become almost universal in some indigenous peoples. No hidden laboratories, no alien introgression, just the relentless arithmetic of survival. Yet one detail nags the researchers. The same FUT2-linked O haplotype that guards against gut viruses also modulates inflammatory pathways tied to autoimmune disease. That twist sets the stage for the 2025 study that claims the modern world may have shed a useful genetic tool without even noticing. Mystery solved? In February 2025, a large international genetics consortium published a peer-reviewed study that jolted both medicine and anthropology. Headlines everywhere echoed the same line. Scientists finally solved the type O blood mystery in 2025. The paper didn't claim anything supernatural. It simply tied together decades of scattered clues in one sweeping analysis of indigenous DNA. The researchers combined full genome data from thousands of volunteers in Central and South America with public data sets from Europe, Africa, and Asia. Their central finding was straightforward. Many indigenous communities still carry the oldest version of the type O gene, virtually unchanged since humans first spread out of Africa. Elsewhere in the world, small mutations have tweaked immune response genes that sit next to ABO. Those tweaks appear to have traded a little extra protection against certain European plagues for a slightly weaker defense against modern stomach viruses. One co-author said this is bad news, and explained it bluntly in the press briefing. It suggests the global population may have lost a tiny but important piece of its original immune toolkit. In other words, the purest form of type O, common among many indigenous peoples, may still carry a built-in advantage against some gut infections. Most of us no longer have that advantage, and we don't yet know how big a difference it could make in future outbreaks. The study stopped short of giving easy answers. It did not say that people with other blood types are doomed, nor did it frame indigenous groups as biologically separate. Instead, it urged more research on how these ancient gene combinations interact with today's diseases. Still, the internet lit up with hot takes, with some commentators spinning the results into claims of hidden superimmunity. Indigenous leaders quickly stepped forward. They welcomed the scientific recognition of their genetic heritage, but reminded the world that they have faced medical exploitation before. They called for stronger safeguards. insisting that any future research must include fair benefit sharing and respect for tribal sovereignty over genetic material. Governments and health agencies reacted too. A few floated the idea of adding blood type gene screening to pandemic preparedness plans. Public health officials emphasized that even if certain type O profiles offer extra protection, vaccines and clean water still matter far more than any single gene. By week's end, 2 points were clear. First, the type O mystery was less about exotic origins and more about who kept the oldest version and why. Second, solving the puzzle raised fresh questions. What other ancestral traits have quietly faded in the wider human family? Could reintroducing them, through old-school breeding or new-school gene editing, do more harm than good? For now, the study's authors urged caution and collaboration. They insisted that the discovery should inspire respect for genetic diversity, not division. Still, the door is open. If the purest type O profile truly holds a forgotten layer of antiviral defense,
these two new studies suggest that type O may offer some protection.
the next pandemic debate might revolve around whose blood carries the past and how the rest of us learn from it. A revelation wrapped in risk. Once the initial shock of the 2025 discovery faded, the public conversation shifted. The headlines cooled down, but the deeper implications were only beginning to unfold. For scientists, the revelation that many indigenous communities carry the most ancient, unaltered version of type O blood was a major breakthrough. But for policymakers, indigenous leaders, and even ethicists, it raised a much harder question. Now that we know this, what do we do with it? At first glance, the answer seemed simple. Celebrate the discovery, fund more research, and look for ways to use this knowledge to protect public health. But the more people looked at the study, the more they saw what wasn't being said. If the purest form of type O blood provides even slight resistance to modern viral infections, especially ones that affect the gut or immune system, what happens when this knowledge is commercialized? The pharmaceutical world took notice almost immediately. Several biotech firms began exploring treatments based on the immune markers found in these indigenous genomes. No one was openly talking about cloning the traits or rewriting genes. But behind the scenes there was clear movement. Data was being purchased, patents were being drafted, and the same story that had once been about survival and ancestry was quietly shifting toward something more profitable. That's where the real tension began. Indigenous communities, many of whom had volunteered their DNA for medical research under strict agreements, started raising concerns. Some said they were not properly informed that their genetic material might be used to develop products or treatments. Others feared a familiar pattern, discovery followed by exploitation. For them, the story was personal. They weren't just data points. They were living descendants of people who had endured centuries of colonization, forced assimilation, and medical abuse. Public health experts weighed in too. Some warned that promoting the idea of superior genes among any group could open the door to dangerous thinking. It's happened before. History is full of examples where science was twisted to justify inequality. While the 2025 study had never made such claims, it didn't take long for fringe voices online to distort it. Some blogs suggested that non-indigenous people were weakened by modern life, while others floated conspiracies about lost civilizations. None of it was grounded in real science, but it spread fast. Meanwhile, medical ethicists issued a more grounded warning. The discovery could divide people if not handled carefully. They stressed that all humans, regardless of blood type, share 99.9% of the same genetic material. This wasn't about superiority, it was about difference. And difference, when respected, can lead to breakthroughs. But when it's misunderstood or misused, it can quickly become a wedge. There were also practical concerns. Should people start testing their blood to see if they carried the ancient O variant? Could insurance companies use that information to adjust coverage or pricing? What happens if someone tries to market supplements or therapies based on unproven claims about this trait? The truth is, science doesn't exist in a vacuum. The moment data is published, it becomes part of a much bigger story. And in this case, that story includes centuries of trauma, mistrust, and ongoing debates about who gets to own biological knowledge. The researchers behind the 2025 paper were careful in their wording. They urged global collaboration, long-term studies, and protections for indigenous rights. But they couldn't control the reaction. Once the information was out, it belonged to the world. And that's the risk. The discovery that once promised answers is now tangled in politics, profit, and identity. What began as a scientific solution to a medical mystery may become something much harder to manage. A cultural flashpoint, a legal battle, or a moral test. The blood itself hasn't changed, but what it represents just became more powerful and more dangerous than anyone expected. The bloodline we almost overlooked. As the noise faded and the headlines moved on, what remained was something quieter, but far more important. A shift in how we think about blood, not just as a medical resource, but as a thread that connects past and present in ways we still don't fully understand. The 2025 discovery didn't rewrite human history, but it added a missing chapter. And that chapter was written, not in labs or textbooks, but in the blood of indigenous people who had carried this mystery quietly for thousands of years. For a long time, type O blood was seen as basic, simple, unremarkable. It lacked the A and B antigens that define the other groups, which made it versatile in transfusions, but scientifically uninteresting. That assumption turned out to be a mistake. What looked like simplicity was actually preservation, and what seemed ordinary was anything but. The oldest version of type O wasn't just a genetic leftover, it was a key to understanding how early humans once fought disease, adapted to harsh environments, and passed on traits that would quietly shape generations to come. For indigenous communities, this wasn't a surprise. Many have long understood that their strength, cultural, physical, spiritual, comes from roots that run deep. The science may be catching up, but the wisdom has been there all along. What the world nearly overlooked, these communities continued to carry, not just in their stories, but in their bodies. The final takeaway from the 2025 study wasn't about fear or superiority or genetic advantage. It was about recognition. Recognition that some answers can't be found unless you're willing to listen to the people who were left out of the first draft of history. Recognition that survival is more than just adaptation. It's about what you choose to hold on to. For now, there's still more we don't know than what we do. The ancient form of type O may help us prepare for future pandemics, or it may simply remind us that evolution doesn't always mean progress in one direction. Sometimes, what's been preserved is just as valuable as what's been gained. The question going forward isn't just what else is hidden in our DNA. It's also, who else holds the missing pieces? And are we ready to treat those answers with the respect they deserve? Because in the end, the mystery of type O wasn't about blood at all. It was about memory, about the quiet endurance of something old and essential, carried across centuries by people the world tried to ignore. Now that the world is finally listening, the real work begins. Not in solving mysteries, but in honoring the ones who never forgot. What do you think about it?